In this video, I'll show you February 10th, 2018, around 6:30 p.m. Deputy Samantha Demirtas of the Fairfield County Sheriff Department arrived at the home of Winnsboro, South Carolina, resident Jada Martin, who had called to report harassing phone calls. Miss Martin lives in an area where all adjacent lots are owned by her relatives and are considered to be, quote, UN, quote, family land. While Deputy Demirtas was taking Miss Martin's report, family members Kareem Martin and Keenan Avery Martin were conducting firearm target practice on another portion of the property.
Walmart, Walmart, she's telling me to come to Walmart to fight her or whatever. Let me see if I can call Tay and see if she know her last
name. Y'all know what's going on?
No.
Central 144. Central 144, I've got several gunshots over here.
Come on, we're 10-something.
Is that you firing over there? Show me your hands. Show me your hands now. Put it down. You have any other weapons on you? Put your hands on your head. Interlace your fingers. Now. You have any other weapons on you?
Nope.
Come over here. Get down on the ground. On the ground, now.
I ain't want to get stopped by the gun.
What are y'all shooting at?
We can't shoot out here.
What are y'all shooting at?
We can't shoot on my property.
What are you shooting at?
We can't shoot out here?
Whose property is it?
My property.
Whose?
My property.
Is it in your name?
Might be.
Mm-hmm. Keep on getting smart. End up going to jail tonight. Mm-hmm. What are y'all shooting at?
We can't shoot. I'm shooting my property.
Do you see what time it is?
I'm shooting my property.
Mm-hmm.
That's illegal?
It sure is when it's the start.
Deputy Demirtas alleges that it is illegal to discharge a firearm when it is dark outside. However, there is no state statute or local ordinance that specifically prohibits target practice or other shooting after sundown. While Section 16-23-440 of the South Carolina Code forbids discharging a firearm at or into a regularly occupied building that is by persons, and Section 16-23-410 criminalizes presenting or pointing a firearm at another person, there is no statute that outlaws using firearms during a certain time of day. Additionally, Section 23-31-510 of the South Carolina Code prohibits a county, municipality, or other political subdivision from enacting a regulation or ordinance that regulates or attempts to regulate, quote, a landowner discharging a firearm on the landowner's property to protect the landowner's family, employees, the general public, or the landowner's property from animals that the landowner reasonably believes pose a direct threat or danger to the landowner's property, people on the landowner's property, or the general public. However, the statute does not forbid counties from prohibiting target practice at night or otherwise regulating the discharge of weapons on private property. The Fairfield County ordinances do not explicitly restrict the right to shoot firearms after sundown, but Section 16-66 of the ordinance states that, quote, any unreasonably loud, disturbing, or unnecessary noise which causes material distress, discomfort, or injury to persons of ordinary sensibilities in the immediate vicinity thereof is hereby declared to be a nuisance and is prohibited this noise ordinance. Can be violated through both continuous sounds and, quote, UN, quote, impulsive sounds, which Section 16-64 defines to include the discharge of firearms. And Section 16-67 explains that when determining if a sound violates the noise ordinance, the Sheriff's Department must consider the intensity of the noise, the general characteristics of the area where the noise is occurring, the time of day or night that the noise is occurring, and the reasonable expectation of quiet that could be expected by individuals on public or private property surrounding the area where such noise is occurring. While it is possible that a court could conclude that Kareem and Keenan violated the noise ordinance by shooting at night, Section 16-68 does not allow a first-time offender to be arrested and states that, quote, any person deemed to be in violation of this article shall first receive a warning from the sheriff's deputy that they must cease any noise disturbance found to be in violation of this article. It should also be noted that, as we will discuss later in this episode, shooting at night might constitute a breach of the peace under South Carolina law.
Shooting on your property, family property is no issue. When you got a deputy out here trying to do a report, it's dark. Common sense. Okay, you knew they were shooting out there?
No.
Yeah, they were shooting earlier.
You got IDs on you, gentlemen?
I'm being detained for what?
You're being detained so I can identify you.
For what, though? What was I detained for?
You're being identified so I can identify who you are and then see if you're also clear. How old are you?
But what was I detained for?
Okay, keep on. So I've got it on camera. Let's go. I've got it on camera that y'all are discharging weapons in an unsafe manner in the air.
How you see me, though? How you see me in front of the house?
Okay. All right.
What we do?
Look, I got no issue with letting y'all go. Okay, especially if your grandma says this is her property and y'all's property. I just want to run you and make sure.
I'm just saying though, like, so like, what's the issue with us identifying
Where's the
ourselves?
weed
It's all
at?
right.
Where's the weed
Am
at?
I lying?
What you mean, where's
got
the
some
weed at?
Am I lying?
So,
Okay.
man,
All right.
ain't nobody got no weed, man.
In response to Deputy Demirtas's call for backup, Sergeant Timothy Inman and Sergeant Chris Darner of the Fairfield County Sheriff Department arrive on the scene and begin to question Kareem and Keenan, who remain silent and continue to refuse to identify themselves. The officers then place Kareem and Keenan into the back of the cruiser while Deputy Demirtas explains the situation, and then returns to complete the original report regarding Miss Martin's threatening phone calls, leaving Sergeants Inman and Darner to question Kareem and Keenan.
Say you shooting gun.
Okay, yeah. I'm being arrested for...
Not identifying yourself.
You see how you looking at that? That don't even sound right, no more.
Well, that's what
That
she said.
discharging a firearm at night. You can't discharge a firearm at night. Says the law.
Who gun you hate?
Says the law.
Yo, why would you down there shooting?
Come on, I was on property.
It doesn't matter. You can't discharge a firearm at night, cuz. You can't do that. It's against the law.
I ain't do nothing wrong with it.
No, here go the thing. Technically by law, excuse me, you mind if I step here? By law, yeah, you did.
What I do wrong?
Discharge a firearm at nighttime. If you want the county, you can go up to and look the county ordinance up.
No, y'all
Any-
started before it got dark.
And once the sun go down, you have to stop. That is what the law states. It is another thing by law. If law enforcement asks you your name, you have to give us your name.
That's
That
by
is
law.
that is by law.
That's
Look
by
it up.
law.
Yeah.
That's by law.
Yes. Look
And
at
under what condition though?
anytime we
The
make
condition-
contact.
Anytime.
Anytime we make
So
contact.
you just hop out the car and ask me.
Yes. I can walk up to you and talk to you on the street and say, hey, what is your name?
I say what? What you say? You said yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is stop and state. This is stop and hop out ID state?
You mean stop and frisk?
No,
That what
stop
you
and ID. For what?
ID.
Yeah, you can't just stop at ID.
Anytime we make contact with someone, yeah, we can.
The sergeants allege that individuals must give their IDs to police officers any time that they request them. However, South Carolina does not have a stop and identify law, which means that outside of a traffic stop situation, individuals generally cannot be arrested for refusing to identify themselves. Further, if South Carolina or Fairfield County were to pass a law that required individuals to provide ID to officers upon demand, it would almost certainly be unconstitutional, while the Supreme Court explained in the 1983 case of Florida versus Royer that, quote, law enforcement officers do not violate the Fourth Amendment by merely approaching an individual on the street or in another public place by asking him if he's willing to answer some questions. This does not mean that officers can force individuals to answer questions or identify themselves under threat of arrest, and the individual, quote, may decline to listen to the questions at all and may go on his way. In the 1979 case of Brown versus Texas, the Supreme Court overturned a conviction against a citizen under a Texas statute that made it a criminal act, quote, for a person. Refused to give his name and address to an officer who has lawfully stopped him and requested the information. The court stated that, quote, The reasonableness of seizures that are less intrusive than a traditional arrest depends on a balance between the public interest and the individual's right to personal security, free from arbitrary interference by law officers. The court also noted that, quote, "A central concern in balancing these competing considerations has been to assure that an individual's reasonable expectation of privacy is not subject to arbitrary invasions solely at the unfettered discretion of officers in the field. To this end, the Fourth Amendment requires that a seizure must be based on specific, objective facts, indicating that society's legitimate interests require the seizure of the particular individual. For this reason, the court held the citizen could not be punished for refusing to identify himself, and that the application of the Texas statute to detain the citizen and require him to identify himself, quote, violated the Fourth Amendment because the officers lacked any reasonable suspicion to believe appellant was engaged or had engaged in criminal conduct. Given the clear Supreme Court precedent on this issue, any statute that allowed officers to stop individuals at will and demand ID without requiring reasonable suspicion would most likely be found unconstitutional. Kareem and Keenan were eventually taken to jail and released the next day after being cited for breach of the peace. In South Carolina, breach of the peace is a common law offense, which means there's no statute that defines it. Rather, the elements of the offense are defined by state case law as the Court of Appeals of South Carolina summarized in the 1996 case of State v. Peer, quote, "The term breach of the peace is a generic one, embracing a great variety of conduct, destroying or menacing public order and tranquility. In general terms, it is a violation of public order, a disturbance of the public tranquility by any act or conduct inciting to violence. Although it includes acts likely to produce violence and others, actual violence is not an element of breach of peace." Additionally, the court explained that, quote, "Whether conduct constitutes a breach of the peace depends on the time, place, and nearness of other persons. The right of a person to use his own property does not entitle him to violate the peace and comfort of others in the vicinity. There is no South Carolina case law as to whether shooting a firearm into the air in a residential area during the nighttime amounts to a breach of peace. But given the broad scope of conduct that is encompassed by this offense, it is certainly possible that a court could conclude that firing weapons at night constituted a breach of the peace. The breach of the peace charge was eventually dismissed, and on February 7, 2020, Keenan and Kareem each filed lawsuits in state court alleging violations of their First, Second, Fourth, and 14th Amendment rights. The defendants had the cases removed to federal court, and Keenan eventually accepted a settlement in 2021. Kareem did not accept a settlement, and on March 1, 2022, the court granted summary judgment to the defendants regarding his Fourth Amendment claims. Summary judgment is a judgment that a court enters in one party's favor without a full trial. Rule 56 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure allows summary judgment to be granted when there is no genuine dispute as to any material fact, and the party requesting summary judgment is entitled to judgment as a matter of law. In many civil rights cases involving police officers, summary judgment is granted under the doctrine of qualified immunity, which protects police officers and other government officials from civil rights lawsuits unless they violate a, quote, UN, quote, clearly established statutory or constitutional right, as the Supreme Court explained in the 2021 case of Rivas Villajas. Cortez Luna, quote, "Qualified immunity attaches when an official's conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. A right is clearly established when it is sufficiently clear that every reasonable official would have understood that what he is doing violates that right. To prove that a right is clearly established, a plaintiff must identify a case that put the officer on notice that their specific conduct was unlawful." While this quote does not require a case directly on point 4. right to be clearly established existing precedent must have placed the statutory or constitutional question beyond debate. This inquiry must be undertaken in light of the specific context of the case, not as a broad, general proposition. In Kareem's lawsuit, the judge determined that the officers were entitled to qualified immunity on the Fourth Amendment claim because there was no case law from the Supreme Court, the Fourth Circuit, or the South Carolina Supreme Court that established that an officer who makes an arrest for breach of the peace in similar circumstances violates the Fourth Amendment. The court also concluded that Kareem's argument, the officers charged him with breach of the peace as pretext to arresting him for refusing to identify himself and disrespecting them, was, quote, meritless and contrary to well-established case law on the arresting officer's state of mind. As of the date of this episode, Kareem's First, Second, and 14th Amendment claims are still pending. Overall, the Fairfield County officers get an F for misrepresenting the law on discharging firearms, claiming to have video evidence that did not exist, demonstrating a blatant misunderstanding of when officers can. Demand that individuals identify themselves and arresting Keenan and Kareem for refusing to identify themselves when they were not legally required to do so. Although the federal court found that the officers were entitled to qualified immunity for the arrest for breach of the peace, at no time during the interaction did the officers even mention a breach of the peace, and they made it very clear that Keenan and Kareem were being arrested because they would not identify themselves. The fact that an officer is granted qualified immunity in a subsequent lawsuit does not mean that their actions were professional, ethical, or even constitutional, and the actions of the Fairfield County officers should not be condoned, regardless of what any court says about their legality. Kareem and Keenan Martin get an A because although they may have potentially violated a noise ordinance, they remained calm and courteous throughout the interaction, tactfully refused to identify themselves when they were not required to do so, and took appropriate legal action following the encounter. While their ability to hold the officers accountable was hampered by a lack of previous case law, I commend Kareem and Keenan for having the courage to challenge the officers' actions. This encounter illustrates the substantial limitations that the doctrine of qualified immunity places on the ability of citizens to pursue lawsuits against police officers who violate their rights and the problematic nature of broadly defined generic criminal offenses. Thank you very much for watching the video. Subscribe our channel for next video.